We are really pleased to have with us today someone you probably know, but to moderate our event, to lead us through this today, teacher and practitioner of Christian Science from Upland, Rob Gilbert.
Thank you very much for coming out today. I mean, this is a tremendous time, and I think as we get along and you see how deep we're going to go on this topic, we really need as many ideas so that we can engage together and feel like a movement, because that's what we are. Everyone is so very important to the world, especially if we engage or unite together and use the monitor as a forum to bring healing to the world. And the world really, really needs it. So I'm so glad that you're here. What I find so stimulating about these meetings on the monitor is that inevitably it leads to deeper thinking about ourselves as Christian Scientists, about our church, and about our leader, Mary Baker Eddy, and the monitor. Not just about the monitor, but it really leads to deep thinking about ourselves and what it means to be a Christian Scientist in today's world. And I think that'll be clear as we go along. To save a little time, let me ask, is there anybody that does not know what the Christian Science Monitor is? Good, that takes care of that. What particularly has stimulated me in the last, 3 or 4 years, been thinking about the monitor for 40 or 50 years, I just feel an internal impulsion to define for myself the monitor. What is the distinctive voice of the monitor? But what has really got me going the last few years is Mrs. Eddy's statement. Now, mind you, she is the most powerful spiritual healer in the last 2,000 years. And she said that when I established the Christian Science Monitor, I took the greatest step forward since I gave science and health to the world. Wow. We all know that science and health heals. How does the monitor fit into the healing activity of the church, and how does it forward our spiritual progress? I don't know that I have heard answers talking about the importance of the monitor going down to that kind of depth. And that's why I'm really looking forward to this meeting. We'll be guided in our discussion today through a video from the Mother Church entitled "The Christian Science Monitor's Role in Your Healing Practice." And the format is going to be, after some comments from Scott Preller, there will be a question, and then there will be speakers that will talk on the question, and then after that there will be a pause, and then that will give us a chance to exchange ideas on that question. There will be 3 questions. I might ask as we go along, because believe it or not, 2 hours is never enough time. So keep your comments brief as we go along, but we do want those comments. We're very grateful to have with us, as part of our discussion today, 2 longtime monitor correspondents, Gloria Goodale and Dan Wood. We also have John Sparkman, who worked at the Publishing Society for 10 years. And they're here not to tell us how to think of the monitor, but to help us deepen our insights into the monitor's healing mission from their firsthand experience. And I want to tell you a little bit about them. Gloria Goodale, would you raise your hand, Gloria? Thank you. Is the LA News Bureau reporter. She began her career as a journalist in the Monitor's newsroom in Boston. She moved west in 1985 to open the West Coast Bureau of the paper's public radio program, Monitor Radio. She then moved to World Monitor, the hour-long news show on the Discovery Channel. After several years reporting for the local CBS radio affiliate, Gloria returned to the Monitor as an arts and culture reporter in 1998. Daniel Wood, Dan, Raise your hand, thank you. Dan came to the paper in 1976 and was the LA bureau chief until he left the staff last September. During that time, he held a variety of positions in both Los Angeles and Boston. They include 4 years as assistant editor of the weekly international edition and several year stints each as special magazine section writer, travel, television, arts, culture, economics, and news writer. And he has won several awards for his reporting. Also with us today is John Sparkman. John, right here. John is a Christian Science practitioner from Oceanside. Before moving to California last October, John spent 10 years with the Christian Science Publishing Society as the managing publisher of the Journal, Sentinel, Heralds, and Bible Lesson. And working closely with the editors of the Monitor, the JSH Online team was able to develop the Eye on the World blog and provide links between the journalistic content of the Monitor and the religious content of JSH Online. Very significant. They will be taking part in our discussion of each question as the Spirit moves them. I might mention, if there's anyone here that has had professional experience with the Monitor over the years, I'm sorry if I left you out, but please feel free to share as we move along. So with that, let's watch the first segment of the video.
Hello, I'm Scott Cruller, and I want to thank you for taking some time to think deeply together about the Christian Science Monitor and how it relates to our practice of Christian Science healing. I'm standing in the original edifice of the Mother Church. All over the world, members of this church are devoted to working together metaphysically to build and strengthen our church. That's why the theme of not only last year's, but this year's annual meeting is a spiritual foundation of Christ healing. That comes from a statement that Mary Baker Eddy makes on page 136 of Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. She writes, Jesus established his church and maintained his mission on a spiritual foundation of Christ healing. When you think what Mrs. Eddy, as the founder of Christian Science, provided for the prosperity of our church, it's almost breathtaking to think about just how lean and purposeful each activity is. Whether you're talking about the simplicity and purity of our church services, or the practical understanding that comes from class instruction, or the deep spiritual nourishment we all get from our individual study of the pastor and the weekly Bible lesson sermons, or the practical and contemporary examples of healing we read about in our religious periodicals. It's so clear that Mrs. Eddy has given us just what we need for successful practice of Christian healing. And it's just there that we have our reason for thinking about why we want to spend some time talking about the Christian Science Monitor. If we accept the premise that everything about our church's design is intended to support and strengthen the ability of its members to be successful healers, and if we accept the premise that nothing about our church would distract us from that singular holy purpose, then we need to ask, what is the role of the Christian Science Monitor in strengthening our healing practice? Why did Mrs. Eddy say on page 353 of Miscellany that it was her desire that every Christian Scientist, that's you and me, and as many others as possible, subscribe for and read our daily newspaper? We've been having a handful of meetings with members of the church to explore together that question of, did Mrs. Eddy feel that the Christian Science Monitor was important to our spiritual growth and practice of Christian Science healing. We knew from the outset that we weren't going to be able to have very many of these meetings. For one thing, we couldn't afford to have the editors and writers of the Monitor keep taking time away. But we found that these meetings were so thought-provoking that we kept wishing there were a way for the whole movement to participate. That's when the idea for this video came, so that you can gather in your church, in your reading room, or even in your living room to think about the role of the Christian Science Monitor and how it specifically relates to your healing practice. The basic structure of this video is to follow the outline of the meetings we've been holding. We would divide those meetings into 3 segments, each discussing a particular question. And after the panel of Monitor staffers had discussed that question, we'd open it up to the audience to hear their inspiration and ideas about that same question. The 3 questions we framed these meetings around were: 1, why did Mrs. Eddy feel the Monitor was important to our spiritual progress and practice of Christian Science healing? 2, how has the Monitor made a practical difference in your life or in bringing blessing to others? 3, how can we better work collectively to handle the resistance to the Monitor fulfilling its purpose? Now we'd like to start with that first question and show you some of the conversations with Monitor staffers and excerpts from one of our field meetings that really deal with that first question.
When you understand something in science, you have an opportunity to prove it. And that's what the Monitor is. It's our opportunity to prove it. And let me just pass on one thought about that. There was a demonstration in front of the White House maybe 3 years ago about Syria. And I always walk by demonstrations just to see what they're about. And there was a woman that broke out of the crowd, and she ran up to me and she said, "Will you pray for us?" I had no idea why she picked me out of the crowd, but I'd like to pass the request on to you. Consider that she came to you. Will you pray for us? The Monitor brings these occasions to us all of the time, and it is indispensable to our spiritual growth to not just be happy with study and feeling happy with our own lives, but to be willing to take on the problems, because that's what we're here for.
Mrs. Eddy wanted a publication that would bring healing, purifying thought, as she called it, to the world, but it would also bring it to consciousness. And the Monitor is particularly good, and perhaps unique, in dealing with human consciousness. And so the Monitor's role is to go out to the world and bring the spiritual reality at work already to the consciousness of our readers, so they can act as Christian healers. For years, as a reader of the Monitor, I thought the purpose of the Monitor was for the Monitor to bless mankind. What I've come to realize is the Monitor is to help our readers bless mankind, especially Christian healers. And it has a larger role of bringing the world to those readers to enable them to be Christian healers.
On page 9 in Science and Health, Mrs. Eddy in the chapter on prayer says, the test of all prayers lies in the answer to these questions. And the first one is, do we love our neighbor better after this asking? We don't often think about prayers necessarily as including our neighbors, right? But in order for them to succeed, in order for us to pass this test, they have to include our neighbors, and we have to love them more after this prayer. So who's our neighbor? The people we barbecue with? The people we go to church with? Well, maybe. But think of Jesus and the Good Samaritan, and that story, that parable, is an answer to the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor? So Jesus is defining who our neighbor is in that parable. And he's saying that the robbed man and the Samaritan are neighbors. Well, what do we know about them? 1, they'd never met. 2, they were from different and even opposing cultures. And 3, one of them needed help. So that's who our neighbor is, as Jesus defines it. And then go back to Mrs. Eddy. The test of all prayers includes, do we love our neighbor better after this asking? So in order for our prayers to succeed, we have to love people we've never met from different cultures who need help. Wow, that's a pretty high standard, right? So how did she expect us to do that? Well, she gave us the monitor that every day introduces us to our neighbors. When I covered Africa, I figured my job was to introduce monitor readers to their 900 million African neighbors so that they could pass the test of all prayers. So what a gift she's given us to ensure that our prayers work.
The longer I'm with the monitor, the more I see the parallel between what's in the lesson and what's coming up in the movement. That's what's coming up in the world. In the manual, Mrs. Eddy, it's directed to readers, but it really applies to all of us. She says that the prosperity of Christian Science largely depends on the lesson sermon. Well, that means the prosperity of the monitor largely depends on the lesson sermon. So in a sense, the monitor is doing just what other newspapers are doing. We're trying to be ahead of the times and see what's coming, but the fact is we know what's coming. We've read the book of Revelation. We know what it means to live where the accuser is not there. And the accuser doesn't have to be in our thought as we go about our work. And it's the lesson sermon every week that provides the basis for that. So you're working for a newspaper, you're doing the same thing, but you're doing something with a spiritual resource in that daily lesson that is of inestimable value.
Okay, at this point in our field meetings, we would stop the conversation and open it up to the audience to hear their ideas and inspiration in thinking about that question. And we'd like to invite you to pause the video now and do the same.
In preface to this first question, I think it would be good to ask, why did Mrs. Eddy establish the monitor? Why did she establish the monitor? For your response, we have some handheld mics that will be coming around. I know it slows down the momentum a little bit, but I think it's important for everyone to hear. So when you're ready to make a comment, just hold your hand up or stand up and a mic will come. Why did Mrs. Eddy establish the Christian Science Monitor?
From a practical standpoint, to deal with the journalism that was being published at the time, and to publish to put a publication out that would be a better example of what truly journalism needs to be.
And what would those kinds of things be?
Honesty and unbiased and non-political.
Great. Some other comments about what the monitor was meant to correct?
So much of our news dwells on the negative, and the monitor doesn't hide from the negative, but it shows us a positive route.
What is yellow journalism? That's a term that's popped around a lot when talking about what the monitor is to counteract. Yellow journalism is?
It's you create a scandal and then you follow it. And the news just keeps continuing and you keep selling papers.
Good. Some other ideas? Why was the monitor established? Why did Mrs. Eddy establish the monitor? And you want to, Lindsay, you want to take the next mic over there? Start here.
It just seems to me that you know, the motto, to injure no man, bless all mankind, is really focusing on the golden rule in a very practical, close way. And sort of seeing that as in heaven, so in my consciousness, so on earth, God is omnipotent, supreme. And that's a big, big order.
It is. Thank you very much. Yes.
I think of it as her very loving way of keeping us from being self-absorbed, and that it would help us see Christian Science not as a a medical alternative, sort of a mental medical alternative, but in fact a science that could apply to global issues, whether it was famine or whatever. And it's not unlike in the early church how the disciples were quite inward looking, and it took Paul to really blast that message out across the Roman Empire to the Gentile thought. And I think the Monitor in many ways is our Paul for this church. It's forcing us to go out into areas where it's kind of pagan, only the pagan is secularism and all kinds of other idols, modern idols. But above all, it keeps us moving our thought outward.
Thank you. On that topic, let's look at her statement when she says to spread undivided the science that operates unspent. Then the second part was mentioned up here, to injure no man, but to bless all mankind. To spread undivided. Not to spread the science, spread undivided the science. Not the science that just operates, but the science that operates unspent. Let's unpack that a moment. To spread undivided the science. Any comments on what that might mean?
No Christianity.
A hand? You want? Spread undivided. Well, I looked it up before I came, where she uses undivided in her writings, her published writings. And it often referred to, there's not a lot of them, but it often referred to the whole garment of Christ. Symbolic, them trying to separate the garment of Christ. She refers to that a couple times in her writings. And in one place, she talks about the divine science of man is woven into one web of consistency without seam or rent. And then in another place she asked, when will it be that we love all mankind with one affection? Undivided affection. Well, what might that mean then? To love all mankind with an undivided affection, and also that in this science that we're spreading, there is no seam or rent. What might that be symbolic of?
Well, for me, if I could just hold on to this mic, we'll get less feedback. For me, having been involved in politics, it means that you can disagree but still love. And we see a lack of that now, but those teachers that I had made me appreciate Mrs. Edding and those thoughts, that we can disagree over an issue, but I can still love you. And that has, I think, where we need to work to be as Christian Science.
Thank you. Symbolic. What are the seams and rents? Right here, Gloria? I didn't mean to put you in a corner. Whatever you want to say, Gloria.
Whatever I want to say. Thank you, Rob. Rob has counseled us to jump in when we think we might have something in addition to what the Monitor reporters have already said. And I think I'm not going to answer the symbolic question. But the thing that I wanted to speak to, and I think it's certainly true for me, and as I've spoken to other Monitor reporters over the years, it speaks to the wholeness question, the fullness of yourself question. Because anytime I've ever gone into a story, I always feel the sort of like the finger of the Christ saying, come deeper, that's not far enough. You have to enter in with your whole being into this story. And I tell you, there are times when I don't want to do that. Because there are places, there are ideas, there are people that I know very little about, and they are intimidating and sometimes dangerous. And I've had to, it's sort of like you don't go there if you're not going to go there with your whole soul and body. And I think of a time going down to report on mafia involvement in Native American reservation dealings down at the border of Mexico. I think of going down to deal with gang issues in the heart of LA. I think of going in to deal with homelessness. And all of these things were things that forced me out of my comfort zone as a human being, not just as a reporter. And I think that's, to me, that's the Christ saying, you have to engage with this issue with everything you've got. It's not enough to just get the facts right. It's not enough to just report the incident. It's not enough to just do who, what, where, why, when, and how. You've got to come in with, and I think that's what Mrs. Eddy really hoped, was that this would bring us sort of like what Madeline was just saying, which is, you know, it's the full year. What is the full grain in the ear? You know, it's the whole Megillah. It's the final thing. You have to engage with the whole world. It's not enough to just do what's comfortable.
Thank you. Yes.
I just have a tiny little point that hasn't exactly been brought out, but you asked us why the Christian Science Monitor was important to Christian Science spiritual growth. And you asked why Mrs. Eddy did this. I expressed these ideas. When the Monitor came forward, as I understand it, was right during the yellow journalism in her life. That this was the basis of why she brought the Monitor forward, and I think it helps to understand that because she was working it out. And she saw how you had to work it out, too. She wanted to end it for everyone, you know. She wanted to end it for all the other newspapers and people and so forth. So I think it's good to get a sense of the basis of what it's about.
Dan?
This is a really extremely interesting story to me, which is that Stephen Gottschalk, in his book, which you've all read, it's nodding. No, the other one, The Emergence of Christian Science into American Religious Life, tells a story I think is completely key to this question. I think it goes on the heels of what Madeline said and what Gloria said. She was teaching her classes, Stephen Gottschalk said. She would ask people, she would ask her students, she would describe this white bridge that's going over to the other side of something. I'm not quite sure what it was. No, but under the bridge was all manner of slime, venom, evil beasts, etc., etc., etc. Which path would you take? She asked. And they said, well, you would go over the bridge. And she said, that is exactly the wrong answer. You need to go under the bridge and deal with every single aspect of mortal mind that's going to throw at you in any direction, any time, any way, in any form. And only then do you get to the other side. I think that's key to what the Monitor is all about. Getting us out of our comfort zones, facing this stuff. We're not a bunch of, you know, spiritual people sitting up in our ivory tower, hoarding our spiritual truths and healing each other. We're in the real world, doing real things, dealing with real problems. Anyway, I think that story is key to what Mrs. Eddy was trying to do with the Monitor.
The historical context of the Monitor explains a lot, but not everything. And I've noticed in my own experience at one time, statements about the historical context I heard and I thought, okay, that sort of answers it for me. But it doesn't answer for me anymore. Especially thinking more deeply about Mrs. Eddy's statement that when I established the Monitor, I took the greatest step forward since I gave the world science and health. Now that statement tells me that a lot of the historical context and what the Monitor is meant to heal, although important, they're not discussion stoppers. There's more. There's more, and that's one of the reasons that we're having this meeting, is to go down deeper. There's so many different levels. All of them are important, but we're moving ourselves towards how does this affect my spiritual practice? Because if the role of the Monitor is to heal yellow journalism, it's to remove sensationalism from the news, to provide the news without frightening people about diseases and thereby causing them if it's our missionary to the world, all of which are important. But that seems to be all the monitor. What does that have to do with me? Other than the one who's giving my per capita tax and sending it in to support that. What does it have to do with me? What does it have to do with my healing work? One last comment that I think sort of bridges over to how does this affect our spiritual growth and our practice is the last part that operates unspent. The monitor is to spread undivided, and we talked about what that means, what it's asking of me and my thinking about the world. No seams, no rent. What science tells me about man. The science that operates unspent. Anybody want to comment about unspent?
When I was establishing the practice a long time ago, I set time aside every day to take the monitor and pray for the issues for the world. That was establishing my practice of Christian Science in practical terms. And I still find, in the middle of the night, when there's something troubling, if I pray for the world, for whatever issues are pounding on world thought, it helps and it brings healing to whatever situation's in front of me. It just lifts all of the personal sense of helping this one or that one or this problem or that problem into a universal, seamless truth that applies everywhere to everyone.
Good example of it not being spent entirely for my own personal ills. Not spent. Oh, Gloria is jumping up and down here. I introduced her, so I have to give deference.
I think this unspent thing, it really feeds into a thing that Dan and I talk about a lot, which is, and actually it came up because we were talking about a friend a long time ago who was fired from the job as a journalist for making up quotes in a story. And he had said, well, you know, I knew what the guy was going to say, so I just wrote it. Right? And that's a very sort of small example, but it points to something huge, which is, and it really speaks to this unspent idea, there is always another idea coming, and that's the unspent science. The divine resource is infinite, and it manifests itself in my profession as you never know what people are going to say. You never know what ideas are out there. So do not for 1 minute think that you have the end of the story. And I think it's really important when you jump from the world of journalism to the larger picture, because you realize the world tries to say that's the end of the story. We know everything. We've got all the answers. And the science operating unspent says there is always something more. There is always something you don't know, and your obligation is to keep asking, keep searching, keep finding.
Thank you. When we say, okay, the challenge to us from our leader is to spread, that in and of itself says something, to spread outside of ourselves, to radiate, to spread, undivided with what that means, one affection, an affection, a concept, an understanding of man without seam or rent, without culture, without political differences, without those kinds of things. Unspent, not just totally with regard to myself. What does that do for our practice and spiritual growth? And it was shared that when there's troubling times, when the individual prays to deal with a worldwide issue, they feel better. There's some connectedness here. And what is that? Maybe we can talk about it for a moment. I would like to just introduce that a little deeper with a healing, interesting article by Herbert Reiki. An individual had a chronic problem that was not yielding, and it came to him, if we're trying to be perfect, in spite of the materialism and evil around us, we may be sincere in our efforts to manifest individual perfection, but never succeed until we deny and reverse the lie of an imperfect world around us and acknowledge the perfection of God and His spiritual universe and man. Then we can be perfect not in spite of the world, but because of the perfection of the spiritual universe. I mean, is it possible to try to live out individual spiritual perfection without dealing with our concept of the world?
Well, in terms of concept of the world, I think one of the things that I appreciate the most about the Monitor is that it truly is an international newspaper. And when Jesus said, you know, lovest thou me more than these, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. In terms of undivided, it sees the world as undivided, and there's no national perspective in the Monitor. It's the perspective from God, which is above a sense of nations, and there are no stereotypes. As Gloria was mentioning, it's really interesting, Gloria, that you should say that we discover freshly, because one of the things I'm most struck by in the Monitor is that going into a country where we have stereotypes of those people or that group, they're removed, and we really do see the situation in truth as God sees it. And I just think it's interesting that she started the Monitor not too long before World War I, when we saw world conflict, that she put this in place, and it's just so wonderful, such a gift.
Down here for John.
All this sharing is just so wonderful. One of the pieces that Mrs. Eddy wrote that we used daily in understanding the right thing to do was a small little article that she called Something in a Name. And I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But it's interesting that with regard to the journal, she talks about putting on record the signs of truth, with the sentinel to stand guard over life, truth, and love, for the herald to proclaim universally the activity and availability of truth. But she shifts when she comes to the Monitor. She then says, I want you to spread undivided the science. The way that this is demonstrated and over again as the truth that we practice. It really was her, you know, if Science and Health was the final revelation of truth to man, her publishing work, including the Monitor, represented the me, the mine, and the all. That we start with ourselves, we move to our church, but ultimately, the greater works is to bless all of mankind. And so when we hold this idea daily in our work, we can't help but be blessed and bless others. So the Monitor really is an essential part of the crown, so to speak, of her publishing work.
Somebody back here.
Christian Science has the word science, and which means knowledge. And when we are physical scientists or psychological scientists or any of the sciences, we are looking at data with objectivity. And that is really what a good reporter does, observe through objectivity. So to me, when she mentions, or when she states that we are to use it unspent, it means no bias for other races or a lifestyle that is not your own, or an observation which has conflict. You present all sides of it. And to me, that would be very helpful in the healing practice, because you're not taking sides. You are seeing what God sees in the spiritual context, which is unspent.
Thank you. You know, we do need to understand the challenge that she's presented. I mean, this is a challenge to get outside of what the world says about you, your tastes, your likes, your dislikes, to asking, to set that aside, and to operate on a different level. I think an early Sentinel, within a month of the monitor coming out, the article said, "The effect of the paper has been to lift one's eyes to a horizon far beyond one's own doorstep. The call to help in the world's thinking is no longer something that can pass unheeded. It is an imperative duty. Things we do not want to look at nor think of, problems we did not feel able to cope with, must now," and now meaning the introduction of the monitor, "must now be faced manfully, and correct thinking concerning the world's doings cultivated and maintained." And this is a challenge. This is a challenge that goes right to the core. And I think the response that Mrs. Eddy got was, some people responded, others were indifferent, still very much caught up in spending it all with regard to my own concerns, and some were prejudiced against it. And that still appears to be going on today. It is a challenge. And it stirs us to take our own personal opinions and being willing to read and focus on the event. But what we're talking about now is, what is that going to do to my healing ability and to my spiritual progress?
Can I say something? I was just thinking about how, as someone mentioned, praying for the world and praying for the ideas in the monitor. And are we expecting to see the result of our prayers in our own lives? So if there was an issue about homelessness, and if we practice, if we begin to pray and to pray about this idea of homelessness, when we go out into the world, are we expecting to see healing? Are we expecting to, in our own lives, come upon the dangerous situation or the homeless individual, as a reporter might do, and to heal that because of the prayerful work that we've been doing through the monitor? And I hadn't thought of it necessarily that way. I thought, okay, I'm going to sit here and I'll pray about these issues. But am I then expecting those prayers to have a result, not just in the area, the flooding in Banda Che or something like that, but in my own life, to see control over the weather, over homelessness, over all these other issues manifested because of the prayerful work in support of the monitor articles and issues?
Sometimes an old comedy routine in the movies, somebody has something they're burning up with, excited about, and they think everyone else is too, and they'll stand up and they'll say, excuse me everybody, and then there's silence. And then they say something, and then after one moment of silence, they're all back buzzing again, just like that. Just for sake of the video here, take just a few seconds, talk to each other loudly so that there's a din, and then I'll hold my hand up and I want to say something from Mrs. Eddy, and then give it 2 beats and go back together again, just to get a feel for what it's like. Okay? Talk to each other loudly for a second. Everybody. I just want to say this. I want you to spread undivided, the science that operates unspent. Okay. That's terrible, isn't it? Let's go to the next question. If there's some more inspiration on these issues, they're going to deepen with the next question, and they're going to deepen with the third question. So let's watch the next video, and perhaps right after that we'll take a short break. Okay?
This next section of our meeting is intended to explore how working with the monitor brings tangible blessing and practical ideas for good to people's lives. When Mrs. Eddy established our church, she could have decided, to really make a difference in the world, we want to have clothing drives and soup kitchens and whatever. But she knew that the real impact of Christian Science in the world was to leaven thought. That's what science would do. And in that context, no Christian Scientist thinks of the periodicals, the organs of the church, the things Mrs. Eddy established as somehow separate from them. That's the wonderful thing about our church. We're all engaged in moving the various activities of the church forward. And so in a very tangible sense, the monitor, to me, has more and more come to represent a kind of treatment by our whole church for the world. It's recognizing what an impact thought that is elevating, that is in a sense having a better view of humanity than it often has of itself. That is making a tangible difference. And if you take, any of us could look at different stories and things and go, well, I'm not sure, that's not the point. It's the effort as a church to say that we believe that how thought is addressed and how we engage and we show a sense of wanting to bless. If you think about that purpose, to injure no man and bless all mankind, what's the difference between that and the purpose of a treatment? You're wanting to bless somebody, to heal them. And so that really is that when we're as individual members reading and thinking about the monitor, it seems to me more and more that needs to be less of a passive thing where, oh, that was an interesting article, but more realizing there is force behind this. There is force of our church of truth embracing the world, and it's going to make a healing difference.
Here's how we're trying to do it at the monitor. Here are three basic services that we try to provide for metaphysicians, for Christian healers. One is that we try to promote understanding across boundaries in the spirit of love thy neighbor as thyself, in the spirit of basic Christianity. Two, we try to surface the models of thought, the ideas that underlie the news, to start resolving things into thoughts, in Mrs. Eddy's words, so that in treating those thought models out there in the news, you can also treat them in your own life. Three, we look for progress. We want to register progress because progress is healing. It's a form of healing. And it's important to appreciate it, to know that it's happening, and to be grateful for it. Now, you could say, well, okay, I can watch CNN or Fox News or subscribe to the Wall Street Journal or The Economist. There are a lot of ways to stay on top of the news. And in fact, there are a lot of ways to get an agenda for prayer. But clearly, Mrs. Eddy expected a Christian Science newspaper to have a different sensibility and different aims. And I will call it a bias. That is, the monitor has a premise that the world is governed by good. And that will be demonstrated. That will emerge. That will become apparent in the news. And to me, actually, that is an incredible, represents incredible confidence on Mrs. Eddy's part, that she trusted that if she hired a bunch of reporters and editors out there covering beats, that they would see the science that operates unspent. At some point, the universe being governed by good would emerge in what you see out there in the world.
I'm sure lots of you saw that video when Ray Rice hit his girlfriend in the elevator. It was appalling. And I think, again, the tendency there is to be so shocked. I mean, Mrs. Eddy would say standing aghast at nothingness, is to be so shocked by that image that you just, you start to internalize that, and it's hard to get above it. But this writer, Stacy, she's really good at this. She looked at that and she said, you know what I see? I see a change in thought. She says, beneath all this, decades ago, for decades and decades, well, really, I mean, without being dramatic, since the beginning of time, people have thought of domestic violence as behind closed doors. Let them deal with it. You know, it was almost kind of accepting something about men, that men needed this outlet, or that maybe the woman deserved it, or something like that. And so, really, until fairly recently, it's just kind of been passed over. It's just kind of been ignored. And what she said, you know, that's not true anymore. She says, increasingly, society is taking a zero-tolerance policy. They're saying, we're not going to put up with this. And what was interesting is that is what she saw in the Ray Rice incident. Was as horrible as it was, people were saying, we're not going to take this anymore. This isn't going to be swept under the rug. We need to take a stand, and we need to say this is not acceptable in American society. That's progress. And it's just a question of how you're looking at these things. And I would argue that this is witnessing the science that operates unspent. It's looking at it in a different way and saying that God is an operation, and that we can see these things when we are not scared enough to look beneath the surface and see what's really going on.
I think what the Monitor does well is to find Christian Science or the Christ in action. A good example of that was last year. There was a terrorist attack in the capital of Canada, Ottawa, and there was a lot of emotion surrounding that, especially among our readers. And so our job is to find a way to counteract that fear and other negative emotions. And I'll give you an example. So one prominent politician, right after the attack, said this, which we highlighted. These acts of terror were driven by hatred, but they were also designed to drive us to hate. They will not, he said. And so this kind of affirmation of truth, of love, of counteracting error is important in Monitor reporting. And it's important to the readers to then use that in their daily prayers.
And I was thinking back to a cover story that I wrote for the magazine a year ago that I was asked to write by your wife, actually, on the mental health care system, which was a pretty foreign topic to me. I'd written, I think she asked me because I've written a little bit about it in the wake of Newtown, but it was not something that I knew a lot about. It can feel like a very difficult subject as a Christian Scientist to approach. And I really had to just trust that this was something that we really, there was a light that we could shine here that was important, that would both shed light on progress that was being made, on the progress that needed to be made, on, a system that really needed more attention, and also used it as a chance to address in my own thoughts some of the claims that were there, that these are, that mental illness has no cure, that this is something that is hopeless. And, in the course of writing, it really felt like I grew so much in my own thinking. I really did feel like I was able to, bring a lot of attention, needed attention to an area that needed it, and also look at some really promising solutions. And then heard afterwards, anecdotally, from several people that it had really been an opportunity for them to increase their own treatment. And in fact, my mom had been at a Wednesday evening service where it was the subject of someone's testimony that this article had really helped them in some treatment for a family member, and also for thinking more broadly about the mental health care system. And just really reinforced for me that there is no subject that the monitor can't treat and treat very well.
Once again, we'd like to invite you to pause the video here and share with one another how working with a monitor has blessed you, and how have you seen it bless others.
How has working with the monitor made a practical difference in your life or in bringing blessings to others? One reason that I've had a great desire to keep deepening my awareness of the monitor is some things that happened to me early on. When I graduated from Sunday school, I got a subscription to the monitor. It was free for 6 months. And then I thought I better know about what's going on in the world, going to college, etc. So I would read an article. But I found that I couldn't just go from one article to the other. There was something in me that I couldn't abandon that issue. And so I would take some simple truth I learned from Sunday school and I would just apply it. My life took off after that. Very dramatic changes took place. And I've asked myself ever since, what happened? Well, I knew, I worked out a theorem for myself, the more I include others in the good I know to be true, the more I find myself included in more good. And that was good for 20, 30 years, but it doesn't do justice. There's something deeper. And then when I was going into the practice, I used the monitor issues as my patients. And I would pray about those issues. And it wasn't unusual that when I would take up an issue, I would find myself healed of whatever it was that I was working on. For instance, there was a monitor series on world debt. And I was praying about that. And then very soon thereafter, my own family debt went down. What's going on here? And then another thing that I learned is that it made me more conscious of a mental environment and not just get so fixated on my particular thing or something just going on in the community here. And I look more closely at Jesus' healing work. How often he dealt with the mental environment when he was healing. You know, the man with they had the palsy, they couldn't get him into the house, and so they ripped up the tiling on the roof, and they lowered him down. He said, "Son, be of good cheer, thy sins be forgiven thee." Nothing happened. Not healed. Then Jesus discerned what they were thinking in the crowd around him, which was, you can't do that. Nobody can forgive sins but God. So Jesus dealt with that error. He didn't have to change everybody's mind. He dealt with that error. Then he said, get up, pick up your bed, and go home. And he did. The mental environment. So I'm still probing these things. What would you have to say? How has your engagement with the Christian Science Monitor blessed you and others from the standpoint of healing? Somebody else have their hand up to get the mic to you? Surely there's got it right here. Go ahead.
The world problems, the world is made up of individuals, so the world problems are individual problems. And so we would treat a world problem the same way we would treat our own problems. Well, 2 or 3 years ago, we went to a talk by Dan and Gloria in LA, and one of the things they shared was Erwin Canham's History of the Monitor, where he said that the purpose really was to be reformative, not alarmist. And then Dan and Gloria brought out 4 objectives that every monitor writer must achieve in writing an article. And those 4 objectives were the 4 things that articulated in a practical way how I would be able to treat a patient, treat myself, treat a world problem. And I thought it would be helpful if maybe Dan or Gloria could share those 4 with us.
Do you want to? Thank you, Ben. Speaking for you
I
both.
think there's 3 more, but anyway. To provide light, not heat. To try and open a person's mind rather than make it up for them. And to emphasize ideas over personality. That's only 3. And the 4th one is,
Bless all mankind.
oh, that bless all mankind is the 4th. Don't you know, man, all the bless. Thank you.
I just wanted to share healing way back to the Vietnam War. I can't remember the exact articles, but they were talking about the boat people and so forth. And I was praying every day knowing that everyone was within God's care and was supported and loved and transported and whatever. Of course, you're talking about somebody in Vietnam, and we're here. A couple years later, I got a call from a friend of my husband's, and he said, I have a little Vietnamese girl I have sponsored, and we want to come over and have dinner with you. Okay, we haven't seen these people at all. Anyway, they came, and this young woman wanted to tell me that she had met this person who was sponsor in a Christian school, but and she wanted to gain enough money to bring her family home over to the United States. But the last day of the war, she was praying and she was walking, and she walked right onto the plane and came home. But she said she had been praying and praying as to what to do. And she got on the plane, came home, and he called us. It just was to me affirmation that the prayer was working, and it did work, and it brought her home and her whole family. Thank you.
Other comments? Yes.
Are you going to limit how much Dan and I can talk?
No.
Because I pretty much can jump up every second, I'm sorry. But you know, I work so much with single lines from the Science and Health during the day because, you know, stuff is moving so quickly. And I try to hold to a couple things in a day. And one of the things that this particular topic brings up for me is there's only one relationship, there's only one identity, and there's only one lie. And the only one lie that there is that there's a separation from God. So if you're talking about any claim against perfection, of course it's in your own experience, because that's the only experience that there is. And I mean, I don't mean to sound sort of loosey-goosey about that. It's really important to understand that there isn't people over there and then you. There's only what's in consciousness. And so I was thinking about how I can't think of a story where I didn't end up having to think deeply about that issue in my own life. And was I ready to have transformative change take place on that issue? Because that's always the source of the resistance of not wanting to get out of my chair and go out and do a story. Is because that issue is, you know, maybe something I just, I'm not really ready for to deal with in my own life. And I was just thinking of this recently. I did a story on homelessness in Pacific Palisades, but it was really homelessness in LA. And I was thinking of all the issues that come up in homelessness, and suddenly I realized that there were, you know, it was really like the entire spectrum of human experience, because it is a claim that you don't have a place in the world. And what are all the reasons that you would not? Addiction, rejection, failure, depression, I mean the whole gamut of the lies against normalcy. And as I was working my way through that story, every single one of those things I realized was coming up for a little bit of addressing in my own life. And I don't think that you can really be a praying, thinking Christian Scientist about anything that you think is out there and not have it begin to bring up those things deep in your own thought, because that's really all there is.
Would you define, what would you say, reformative healing? What's the term you use?
Transformative was the word I used.
Yeah. Define that.
Well, to expect literally for your nature to be transformed, for your vision, for your idea, of reality to be transformed through tackling the issue that is coming into your thought. It appears to be coming as a Syrian refugee or a Palestinian dissident or a, whatever, a Pakistani terrorist. It appears to be coming in that form, but it's really in its purest form. It is the one lie again. And if you handle it, you are going to be transformed.
Great, thank you. And one of the visions that came to mind as you were talking was how Mrs. Eddy opens her chapter on Christian Science practice. And she has Simon the Pharisee that she's contrasting with who's been called the Magdalene. And she says of the two that which was the highest tribute to the Christ, the hospitality of the Pharisee or the contrition of the Magdalene. And thinking about that, hospitality is not a bad word, you know? It's not a bad word. Hospitable to the Christ. But how different than the effect that it had on the Magdalene. I mean, even if he had provided Jesus with a bowl of water, that's a thing. Jesus said, she's been bathing my feet with tears. Where did his water come from? Where did her tears come from? I mean, it seemed to me that he was hospitable to the Christ, but he was holding the Christ at arm's length. She was welcoming the Christ into her heart, transformed her nature. And so Mrs. Eddy uses that as the model of what? A good patient? A good practitioner. A good practitioner. I think it raises the question, are we, like Simon the Pharisee, hospitable to the Christ? Entertain the ideas? It's a good idea. Intellectually, I admit, yeah, there is such a thing as light. It's another thing when you admit the light into your heart and darkness is dispelled. I think the monitor presents that challenge to us. And I hope we aren't lighthearted about the challenge, because the challenge goes really deep. Any other comments?
I'm so grateful this question came up, because it reminded me when I was working at a Christian Science facility in Arizona. I was sitting with a patient, and she asked me, "Mary, do you pray daily for the monitor?" And I looked at her and I said, "Be honest, no, I don't." And she was a Christian Science practitioner almost all her life. And she lived in California and had an opportunity to move to a very remote area. And when she got there, her phone wasn't ringing. And she thought, what's going on? And so she called her teacher and said, "Why is this not working? You take your practice with you." He said, "Have you been reading the Christian Science Monitor every day?" And she said, "No." And he said, "I want you to take 3 articles. I don't care what it is. Just take 3 articles out of it. And I want you to pray for it. And watch what happens." And she did. And she was obedient. And when she got finished with her 3rd article of reading it, the phone was nonstop. So it opened my eyes to that once she said that how she was blessing and being blessed.
A series of activities going on when Mrs. Eddy brought the monitor to fruition was the challenge to her leadership from without. In other words, the next friend suit wanted to take away all of her abilities and give it to a board of trustees, yeah. And but there was also that which was threatening her leadership from within her church. And the recent Longyear film brought out that Mrs. Eddy was noticing a growing complacency within Christian Science. Something to think about. Let's watch the next 3rd segment. Oh, just a moment. Yes? Have a question here? Comment?
I want to extend my gratitude for the reporters, for the Monitor, that the Monitor has such a group of people who can bring us the true story of whatever they're writing about. And I trust the Monitor. I have had a subscription for 65 years, non-stop. I know what I read in it is absolutely true. And I know that blesses me and others because I've shared the Monitor many times and something I've read in it or know about it. Anyway, I want to express my gratitude for the thought. Mrs. Eddy wanted us to know the truth about things and not just whatever anybody's writing. The Monitor is so special, and I think we all are very grateful for it.
Thank you. We'll have Dan respond to that after this next video segment.
In the final section of our meetings, we focused on working together as a church to handle the resistance that would keep the Monitor from fulfilling its purpose.
We just marked the 10th anniversary of the Indonesian tsunami, which killed 250,000 people. Obviously, it was a huge story. It happened right after Christmas, 2004. And we deployed as many resources as we could. I was working with one more senior correspondent who was sent down there, very skilled correspondent, but had never covered a disaster zone like this. And it truly was a disaster. You can think in terms of what it would be like to go into a place. There weren't even road signs. You couldn't figure out how to get around places because everything had been washed away. People lost their bearings, literally as well as figuratively. And I think this correspondent walked in and it was mentally very challenging, physically very challenging. Everything about it was difficult. Being aware of this, one night it just seemed to be a very daunting picture of the sort that could threaten to freeze you up and not let you do your job. So one night at work, I started thinking about this, and the Bible verses about the wind, the earthquake, and the fire came to thought, and that the wind passed by and broke the rocks, but God was not in the wind. And the earthquake happened, but God was not in the earthquake. And fire, but God was not in the fire. And then the still small voice. And that was what was heard. And I thought, that still small voice is discernible in Banda Aceh, Indonesia. It can be heard. Even amid all this death and destruction, which was what everybody was focusing on, there is a still small voice to latch onto and to hear. So I wrote this all down in an email, and I had to fight some resistance on my part because I thought, I'm not there. I'm not dealing with this. I am sitting in my nice, comfortable office. Who am I to tell this correspondent, listen for that still small voice? But that was I had to overcome that myself. And of course, sharing that inspiration, I had to trust my inspiration and trust the desire to share it. It was great for me because, again, it just reinforced my sense that we could approach this tsunami and earthquake in a way that was healing. And I sent it. And the next day I got a note back from the correspondent saying that it had broken the logjam and that it just had had the healing effect of uplifting. I had felt uplifted by this, thinking about that still small voice, and that it broke a logjam for him. And what was so interesting was, at that point, he connected with a man who he had been moved by the disaster. He came to the area, he found a kind of rickety old boat, bought supplies, and started distributing them to people in very hard to reach areas. So, what a wonderful way that was to cover the tsunami, instead of just going at it the big picture, here are the big numbers, which of course you have to provide. He found a man who was not familiar with the situation and everything, but felt so moved to help and was really blessing his fellow man and was being his brother's keeper. And it was such a wonderful vehicle to, I felt, help the reader relate to what was going on there. And it also broke this logjam that suggested that we could be so paralyzed by error or claims of lack and death and destruction that we couldn't find where the light was. We couldn't find the people who were working to ameliorate the situation.
You know, when you're a reporter and you call someone up on the phone, you know, where are you from? The Christian Science Monitor, it used to be that people would immediately, a lot of people would know what that was. It's not so true with younger people today, and it's certainly not true in other countries. And in France, there was a widespread belief that Christian Science and Scientology were the same thing. Scientology was criminal, was illegal. And so any conversation I made was an opportunity for disaster. And I started wishing that the name of the monitor had been the Monitor. I mean, that would be great. I mean, everyone likes the Monitor. And at that time, Monitor Radio was the Monitor. And I thought, why couldn't we have the Monitor, just no Christian Science? And that's, you know, going back to, again, this is what Mary Baker Eddy's students said at the same time. Okay with the paper, but, you know, ixnay, aimnay, you know, don't go with that name. And that really has been the best part of this job, the name. Because you simply cannot say it without putting together two words that the world does not understand and is usually shocked by. And often people will say to me, I don't know that paper, but how could those two names possibly go together? And it's an opportunity often to talk about it, but it's also an opportunity to just work on that. Those two names do belong together. I mean, putting those two names together is probably the most important thing that happened in the last century. And we have an opportunity of living it. And it's just, every aspect of the Monitor has that element to it. There's something spiritual behind it. And when you run up against resistance, this is actually a very long story, but let me say it in a very short way. Before I worked for the Monitor, I had an occasion to run into a member of Congress. And a mutual friend put us together and thought that it would be good for me to meet him. And we were on a small plane together. And the plane took off from the runway. There was just 3 people in the plane. And as it was taking off, he said, by the way, I hate the Christian Science Monitor. And he says, and I'm not going to talk to you. I said, no, this would have been a useful thing to say on the tarmac. I wasn't sure how happy, useful it was there. Okay, fast forward almost 20 years, and he's still in Congress, but my job is now to cover him. Now, I don't know if he remembered that incident. I mean, we kind of talked around it at one point, but I'd had 20 years to think about it. And to think about his identity, the identity of the newspaper. And over time, the end of the story is, without all the rest of the details, the last conversation I had with him, he said, you know, when people ask me what I think, I circulate your article. Because he says no one has ever put together as clearly what it is I think. Now, I don't agree with what he thinks. But I was very grateful to see how a belief as stark as that could be changed. And that is the power of the Christian Science Monitor. It wasn't a human evolution. It was the conviction that, that it is possible to work in a Christian and a scientific way, and the two are absolutely conjoined.
People are tempted to read the news through a political lens or their own perspective on things. And I think that's always a little bit dangerous. Even though there may be articles people disagree with, or you think, why did you cover it that way instead of this way? I think the starting point should be the effort here is to bless all mankind and to injure no man. And to start with, if I'm opening up the monitor, if you're thinking about the magazine, or if I'm clicking on the homepage, am I starting right now? What can I learn about all mankind here? Where can my thinking help elevate what the world is wrestling with today? And I think if people can include, actively engage about what is my responsibility as I read this story. And it may not mean that you're going to rush out and join some activist organization. It may not mean anything like that. But what can I bring that will elevate my thinking?
Well, the Monitor has been struggling for almost 20 years with the impact of the internet. And this has shaken up journalism quite a bit. And we have tried different ideas and different things. And so we're really welcome readers' input on what they want in the emerging technology that the internet provides and all the digital manifestations of that. One powerful disruptor that the internet brings is that it allows readers to go anywhere and find anything, often for free. So the business model of the Monitor is in constant flux. So that has forced the Monitor to think about what it does uniquely and to find those readers who want what only the Monitor can bring. So a key component of that struggle is having input from our readers, our key readers, and this is identified Christian Scientists as our primary readers, on what we can do better for them. Because again, the Monitor in blessing blesses through its readers. It's not the Monitor going out to the world, it's the Monitor going into your world and enabling you to be the blesser.
Once again, we invite you to pause the video and share with one another how your own metaphysical work is handling that resistance to the Monitor's purpose, and how we can work together more effectively as a church going forward.
I think what was being brought out is there's resistance to the Monitor and ultimately to Mary Baker Eddy's leadership from outside, and there seems to be resistance from inside. And I'd like us to talk about that a little bit. First, I was wondering if Dan could stand up and tell us a little bit about some of the challenges in a unique assignment that a Monitor reporter might encounter.
My mind's a blur right now, because that was me she was talking about. And I have to say it was the most transformative thing that ever happened to me. And that was going to Banda Aceh. And I was completely overwhelmed. This is a good metaphor for what goes on in all our lives in a smaller way. I was completely overwhelmed by all the sensory details. I felt like I was playing a poker game with mortal mind. Mortal mind says, oh, you can't go out there, there's tetanus, measles, malaria. I'll see that, I conquer that mentally, and then I'll come back. You can't get around, there's mud everywhere, there's still earthquakes. And people were, crying everywhere. There was mass graves everywhere. I was completely overwhelmed by this. And her comment about going to this still small place is fabulous. And I'll just give you one other thought about that, which was that I was praying with the idea of bearing witness, because bearing witness was in the Golden Text that week. And that's how I got to a still small place, was just to claim each time I came up to one of these things I didn't think I could deal with, that I am here to bear witness to the truth. I'm not here to sell newspapers, I'm not here to tell a story, I'm not here to make money. I'm here to bear witness to the truth. And when I did that constantly, I got led, like as she said, to this guy who had a boat who was going down Sumatra distributing tools that he paid for with his own money. And it was a little bit different kind of a story, because a normal journalistic story is you just go ask a bunch of people, something happened, what do you think about it, what do you think about it, what do you think about it, put it all together. This was a different kind of a story. They wanted a narrative story, which means you hang out with somebody all day long. And then you write, oh, at 10 o'clock he gets up and he goes over here, and at noon, and then, all the way through an entire day. And so here I am trying to wander around Banda Aceh. People are trying to deal with this tragedy. Who's going to want to hang out with me? But I heard about this guy, and I thought, oh, this is great. I will do this. And he said, okay, that's great. He couldn't do it that day for some reason. I can't remember now. But I continued to be still, and I really feel like I was led. About 3 days later, I just sort of, for whatever reason I can't even remember, I wandered into this little common area. And lo and behold, this guy walked around the corner and he could do it. And I feel like I was completely led to find this guy by being still and not succumbing to all this sensory overload. And it was constant. And that was a transformative story for me. I felt like I was Job and Jonah all at once. They had to go to Banda Aceh. No, I think I'll go to Alaska, but thanks very much. So there, I didn't have resistance when I got the call, and that's a pattern that we all know about, refusing the call. Anyway, so that's a little bit of background on that. It was transformative for me by claiming to bear witness to the truth and to get to a very, very still, small place in a constant way.
I think in a lot of ways, perhaps Mrs. Eddy, by being vehement on the fact that Christian Science will be in the name of the Monitor, was also, with everything else, a way to empower the Monitor with the spiritual authority of her church, so that reporters on assignment experience that power. Over the years, I've heard a variety of experiences. Remember one longtime correspondent said he was in Iran at the time that it was rumored that the Shah was going to leave the country. And he told a group of us that there was a press conference. And they thought, oh, here it comes. Everybody was invited in the media, except for the Monitor. And he did everything he could to turn that around. Called church headquarters to do everything they could to turn it around. Nothing doing. And they had the press conference. He said it turned out to be a ruse to get all the media out of the way so that they couldn't see the Shah moving from home to the airport, and the crowds and the wonderment on what the future is going to hold. The authority of her revelation there to support and maintain. He also said he was on getting back to the Middle East. He had a short layover in Heathrow from Boston, very late at night landing, and his luggage didn't come. And he was waiting there, and everyone got their luggage left. He said it was deserted. And what am I going to do? He called a friend of his, a practitioner, who reminded him of a passage. I don't know if I can recite it, but he said, you know where Mrs. Eddy has baggage in Science and Health? He said, I don't have time for this guess trivia kind of thing. But he said, no, it says that are likened to the cattle on 1,000 hills. They carry the baggage of stern resolve and keep pace with highest purpose. And he said, you are our highest purpose right now, and your baggage will keep pace. You know, went back, deserted, silent, you know, the conveyor. All of a sudden, the light comes on, spits out his one piece of luggage, and then silence again. Thank you, God. We do need to support that. Outside resistance and inside resistance. I was thinking about inside resistance, and was thinking of things that I've heard over the years, why people resist taking the monitor. And one of those things is that I have all I want in Christian Science with the religious periodicals. I don't need to engage the world with a monitor. What does one do with something like that? Oh, it's a toughie, huh? What about that? I have all I need. I got the lesson sermon, I have the journal, I have the Sentinel, I have the Heralds. I don't need to engage the world with the monitor. Oh, okay.
You know, this is something we talked about before this, and I was thinking about this as Dan and I have lately gone to the two movies that are out, Risen and The Young Messiah. And the thing that just hits you when you're watching these movies, because the thing they share, The Young Messiah, is about Jesus at age 7, and Risen is about the 3 days after the crucifixion and then leading up to the ascension. And the thing that hits you, oops, okay. The thing that hits you as you're watching this is the completeness of the message. And I was thinking about this when Rob was talking, because to me, the monitor completes Mrs. Eddy's vision. It completes the full sort of toolkit that you need. And I was thinking about that because when you're watching these movies, this story, the narrative again, you realize Jesus' message was only complete with the ascension and with the signs following and the resurrection. In other words, it had to have everything. There were probably plenty of people who saw him heal people and thought, well, wow, that's amazing. And that's the whole story. No, it's not. It wasn't the whole story. You needed to have the full message. And I think for me, and if I was ever talking to someone who felt that way, I would probably say that it's the complete vision. And the monitor is an integral part of that. And and maybe John actually might want to talk about this, because one of the things that I think we've just seen with the redesign of ChristianScience.com is a reintegration of the monitor into the toolkit of JSH, so that the monitor is front and center, and you realize how it had kind of been separated. It was the monitor website, and then you had JSH, and it kind of felt like a separate thing. But the monitor now in this new redesign is it doesn't overshadow anything, it's just part of the complete toolkit.
John, would you respond?
Sure. I'm going to tell a little bit of a sad but funny story. When I became the managing publisher of the periodicals, the religious periodicals, we were all in the publishing building, and I got on the elevator one day with a person who I recognized as a reporter for the Monitor. And I pushed button number 3, and he pushed button number 2, and there was that moment of, well, we should probably say something to each other. And he said to me, "What's on the 3rd floor?" The entire JSH and Bible lessons occupy the 3rd floor of the publishing building, and the Monitor occupies the 2nd floor. And here was a person saying, "Well, what's above me?" Well, I can attest that that's no longer the case. The clarity that's come through the work of everybody in the publishing society right now, at least when I left 6 months ago, is to see this unity, this grand publishing idea that Mrs. Eddy gave. And the introduction years ago of the eye on the world that the Sentinel does to try and bring the monitor and the periodicals together, and then the inclusion of the daily news briefing, which is just a marvelous piece that the monitor puts out as included as part of JSH. Well, in one day, by including the daily news briefing in JSH, they 5-timed their circulation of that wonderful piece being read. We are so powerful when we stand together. And we're so separate, we're so vulnerable when we don't. And that's really what's happening today in our movement. I mean, we see it everywhere. You know, the wonderful annual meetings that have been taking place about, you know, why are we healers? You know, it's just what we need in the world today. I mean, there's not a place on the planet where your prayers can't reach. And the monitor tells us those places that it's most needed. The Journal was the first, the Sentinel second, the Heralds followed. The Monitor was that brought it all together and allowed science, the science of the Christ, to reach the world. It's an essential part. And to that person who isn't subscribing, I tell them that there's some cards out in the back where you can subscribe. And it is an essential part of our toolbox. That idea of a prayer toolbox is a wonderful, wonderful metaphor.
John had mentioned to me before the meeting the one individual who has successfully put it all together. Journal, Sentinel, Heralds, the lesson sermon, the textbook, the monitor, and
It all resided in Mrs. Eddy.
right.
To believe that they can't work together, that all those ideas are disparate, is disproved by the fact that Mrs. Eddy, in her expression of divine truth, held them all and gave them all to us. I mean, it is not a surprise, but it is remarkable.
No wonder she put on the typeface that motto. First, the blade, then the ear, and then the full grain in the ear. We have the culmination of her vision of Christian Science for the world. How powerful that is. Another resistance is the monitor reporting offends my world view. Especially politically, economically, socially, maybe every other which way. It offends my world view. And when I was thinking about this, I thought, you know, mortal mind claims to create mortals in a particular timeline of the material dream of life and matter. And that through material culture, nationality, race, and religion, places mortals on one side or the other side of the world's divides, and in this way perpetuates its feuds. It says that about you, and it says that about me. I was created in a particular time and place, and the way I was raised has put me on one side or the other, at least inclination-wise, of the world's feuds. So a person may feel very, very strongly about a point of view. And here comes the monitor, at least Mrs. Eddy's intent, to ask, instead of being a mortal partisan, as if the world needed another mortal partisan, and ask you to be a healer. That's a huge challenge. That's huge. Dan, can you quickly make a comment about all of your coverage of people on one side or the other of an issue and what you found out? Quickly.
Several people told me they're already trying to leave, so I'm going to rush through this. They'll give me an excuse for... Anyway. I spend my time as a journalist calling one person, I do this all day long. I get the story about whatever, is happening about issue A. Well, that's fascinating, that's amazing, thank you. I feel like that's the whole story because they're usually very articulate and convincing.
With a lot of data.
With a lot of data. And then I call another person. And they're equally convincing with a different story, also with a lot of data. And the thing about the Monitor is, the people we talk to are probably the highest, thinkers in the world. Many are heads of, universities and their own think tanks. And they have, research to back this up. And one story, I think is one you're thinking of, when I was early on out in California, I was looking into immigration. God, that issue doesn't come up anymore. And the first speaker I talked to said that immigrants are a boon to the California economy by $60 billion, or some incredible figure. I thought, okay, that's amazing. He sent me all this research. And then the other guy had equal research in the other direction. And if I don't want to double the story, I don't know how to end it right now. Here's how I'll end it. This is a template for everything that's happened in my career, is the story of the Santa Cruz earthquake, which was that the downtown fell down. This is you can see this whole picture. And so the town was trying to figure out how to put it back together again. This is very simple. And as I went to do this story a year later, I was walking around the town with the mayor, who was telling me that this town, for decades, was split right down the middle between environmentalists and conservatives. Business versus liberals, tree huggers versus business people. So here they are, being forced into this room, like maybe about this size. Our downtown is falling down, what the heck are we going to do? And to shorten the story, I will say that they, over time, they use this energy of anger to really find out, geez, that Joe Blow, he's a pretty nice guy. I sort of like him. And they forged this agreement whereby they put the town back together, and they both realized, but each side had to realize that something the other side was telling them was true. Environmentalists had to realize that they needed some stores if this town was ever going to be viable. And the business people said, we've got to give up on some of these environmental, I'm saying this wrong, environmental regulations. Anyway, they both did, I won't say it's compromised so much as they each expanded their view of what the town was and who they were and what it needed.
You mentioned several times that over the years, you found neither this side nor that side, but there's often a solution that's above those two, but includes them.
Right, I would say that that's a pattern, and you can all run home and say that a guy who reported for the Monitor for 40 years saw this pattern, so you can be happy. Which is that there is a space between two opposing sides that is not necessarily compromised, it's driving both to a higher place. And what happens is self-evident. Both sides go, oh, yeah, of course. And neither side had to change who they were. They said, this is an of course, aha moment.
Thank you. Yeah, that's it. I remember somebody told me one time that they were very much riled up about political kinds of things going on in their branch church. And she was sitting in the audience, and she had her arm in a sling. She had fallen off a ladder and separated her shoulder. And when this idea was brought up that sometimes that which we are so passionate about in terms of organizations, if you're not careful, you're accepting it with regard to your own being. And she went, holy smokes. For years, I have believed that my branch church was so internally divided that it was restricting their outreach to the community. Those are the very symptoms I've been dealing with. So right on the spot, she took everything that she was affirming for herself, in spite of the evidence of the physical senses, and transferred them to her branch church, despite the evidence of the physical senses, she was healed on the spot. This idea that we can disengage from mortal mind, putting us on one side or the other, and be on God's side and bring healing. One of the last comments I've heard is that the world is too disturbing. I get so disturbed when I engage with the world, and I find it very complicated and confusing, and I don't know how to pray for the world. What about that? Evelyn?
What comes to me is Jesus talking to Peter in the morning meal. When he asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" He didn't answer 2 times. So I'm thinking that we can't leave the monitor out of Mrs. Eddy's unfoldment. It's the 3rd question, "Do you love me? Feed my sheep." So if you're just going to do the 2 that takes care of my problems, but leave the world out, then you're just not listening. You got to hear that.
Comment from beside you, gentlemen?
Yeah, in my own life, praying for myself and in praying for issues that I find in the monitor, the idea of being disturbed, I've come to think of as a good idea. It's good to be disturbed, and it's good for me to not spend my time trying to figure out what is the true lie here, but to go higher to that place that we've been talking about. There is a solution, but it's not in the contents of this disturbance. There's no true lie.
I heard somebody present it in an interesting way as ideas from a Christian Science definition as the immediate object of spiritual understanding coming from God, and ideologies, which are doctrines and opinions and theories. And that's often at war. Ideas versus ideologies. Ideologies that we may identify with strongly. But I heard somebody present one time that human institutions are temporal. And that they cannot, in and of themselves, solve any problem without divine intelligence. I guess one would say that too of the Christian Science Church. Can it, as an institution, solve the problems in and of itself, the people that are involved? It's interesting that Mrs. Eddy gives a definition of that which, based on principle. The monitor itself, can it do its work without that intelligence from above? To think that an institution, on one side or the other, is going to solve the world's problems, I think we can consult Mrs. Eddy to see what she has to say about that. As far as the disturbance goes, I think Dan's comment about Mrs. Eddy portraying a white bridge with all kinds of terrible things in the ditch does bring to light that Christian Science is not oriented towards escapism and closing our eyes to what needs to be handled. Any other comments on this subject? Right here? Is there another hand somewhere where the mic can go? Okay, people want to go home.
Well, as this meeting has progressed, it occurred to me that the term Christian Science monitor is a blessing for the entire world, because Christian Science says God is here. Not the monitor, I mean, that would be the human ideology, perhaps. But the fact that, as Mrs. Eddy says, God's being is infinity, freedom, harmony, and boundless bliss. Well, that statement to me is also a progressive statement. It starts with infinity. So the monitor starts with Christian Science, meaning God, infinity, is here where that problem or situation seems to be, and God will certainly heal it.
Thank you. Couple last comments. One of the things that gave me some stirring insights into the life of our leader was when I started looking up the definitions of biblical prophet in the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible. Wow, what I read there told me a lot about the life of our leader. And what I read about Mrs. Eddy's life told me a lot about the life of a prophet. And the point is, Mrs. Eddy's work fulfilled Bible prophecy. And her work was the woman that took leaven and put it into 3 measures of meal till the whole was leavened. The leaven is at work. And the whole area of science, theology, and medicine, and all the human institutions that are based on that material sense of things is percolating. And the world is seeing enormous changes right now. And I wonder if we have the insight to discern the leaven at work with a singular purpose: to destroy sin, disease, and death by casting down the belief that there's life, substance, and intelligence in matter. One singular purpose. So when Mrs. Eddy's followers were being healed, she said, that's great. It's only the bugle call to the higher mission of the Christ power to take away the sins of the world. I think it's an enormous shift to go from just physical healing, stop it there, to dealing with the sins of the world, which I've come to see wasn't just people's individual acts of gambling and murdering and so forth, but the authority of sin, claiming that man is separated by nature from God, that God is spiritual, man is material, God is innocent, man is guilty. And if we have an individual case of healing and follow through by destroying the belief that caused it and wiping it off the map so that it never, ever has existence or present itself to anyone again, that's tremendous. And then this other point, Mrs. Eddy the prophet talked about, and I don't know that we read it very often, she says that this world is even now becoming the arena for conflicting forces as a result of the leaven. And she talks about, help me with the sequence, that the breaking up of material beliefs may appear to be famine and pestilence and want and woe, which assume new phases until their nothingness appears. She said there are going to be climatic changes. I mean, she says it, right, in Science and Health. And then she also says that during this period, wicked minds will try to create more evil. But then her conviction was that those who discern Christian Science will do what? Hold crime in check, aid in the ejection of error, and cheerfully await the certainty of ultimate perfection. You know, with the world's methods of trying to combat what's going on today, there's no cheerfulness there, there's only complaint. But lifting thought to this higher level, how powerful that is. I can't see how we can aid in the ejection of error and hold crime in check without monitor reporting. There's a connectedness there that must come together, and we can do better at it, both sides, as we hold this ideal. Last comment. I was thinking of the monitor as Mrs. Eddy's last gift to her church and to humanity. And as I was thinking about that, I thought about Jesus' last gift. And it was a parable that he acted out. Just a few hours with his disciples and what to do. And he lays down his garments, girds himself with a towel, bows, literally kneels, and washes the disciples' feet. I think in that act, he was summarizing everything that he had done up to that point, giving them a context in which to measure what was going to happen and how to survive in the turmoil and the chemicalization that his resurrection was going to certainly bring to earth. And he had been washing their feet for 3 years, washing the materiality off of their thinking about themselves and others. And that was pretty motley crew, you know. I looked at him recently and I thought, oh my gosh, you had Simon the Zealot. That was a political group who wanted to overthrow things. And then you have Matthew the tax collector that was working for them. I wonder how they got along as they were walking mile after mile. You know, you sow what you, back and forth. But now Jesus said, you're going to have to do it for yourself. And this is the way that you're going to stay together. And this is the way you're going to add to your number. And this is the way you can survive. So I started thinking of Mrs. Eddy's last gift, the monitor. To me, I saw some parallels. Jesus, it was the last few hours of his being the personal Savior. Mrs. Eddy, the last couple of years of her being a personal leader. And she was going to leave. And that it was so much bigger than we knew, but she knew, as Jesus' mission was so much bigger than the disciples knew. And here is a way for us to stay together, to be able to survive, to be able to move forward, to be able to calm the excitement that the leaven is creating. And so putting it all together for me was that the requirement is that we must lay down our personal assessment of anyone and bow unreservedly to what God is telling us about man. That we must lay down our personal assessment and opinions of ourselves and others unreservedly and bow before what God tells us about his creation in man. Thank you very much.